Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining. This is Diane Yentel with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a national membership organization dedicated to achieving socially just public policy that assures that the lowest income people have decent, safe, and affordable homes. So I'm President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'm joined today by Sarah Mickelson, the Director of Public Policy, and Elayne Weiss, our Senior Policy Analyst. And I'm thrilled to say that we have over 1,300 people registered for this webinar today. So clearly, many of us are looking for answers, very interested in and trying to decipher what the outcome of the elections means for affordable housing. And certainly none of us have all the answers. There's a lot that remains unclear and unknown, but we do have some clear indication of what's ahead in 2017 and beyond for affordable housing, and that's what we'll talk about today. And just to be clear, the outlook for affordable housing and community development programs is pretty tough for the next few years. And some of the challenges ahead would be there regardless of the outcome of the elections, especially around budget and appropriations, and others have become more challenging because of it. And so the overarching message or takeaway that I hope you all take from today's call is that while we certainly have our work cut out for us, when we work together as a unified force for affordable housing solutions for the lowest income people, and when we continue working to build and expand our coalitions with other sectors, we can be successful in both protecting critical programs from harmful cuts and in looking for ways to expand affordable housing solutions for the poorest. And we have to, right? Because one thing that didn't change from the election is the need. There's a gap of 7.2 million units of housing affordable and available to the lowest income people. 75% of the lowest income families, these are families with kids, they're vets, elderly people, people with disabilities, they're paying half their income on rent, leaving little left for food, medicine, and other necessities. And only 1 out of every 4 poor people in need of housing assistance receives any help at all. So all of this was true before the election, and it remains true today. So our webinar today is focused not just on the challenges ahead, but also on the actions that we can take to protect and expand critical affordable housing solutions. So we're going to talk today about both the challenges and the actions in 5 ways around protecting critical affordable housing resources, ways to share the success of these programs, ways to protect the National Housing Trust Fund, to reprioritize federal spending on housing, and to include housing in any kind of infrastructure package that moves. So I'll turn it over now to Elayne to start us off.
Thank you, Diane. So, Congress is likely to pass another continuing resolution, or CR, to keep the government funded through this coming spring. The previous CR that Congress passed in September expires a week from today. We're now hearing that the CR will run through the end of April to accommodate the Senate's busy schedule in confirming Trump's administration's political appointees. The House plans to release the text of the CR next Tuesday and will hold a vote that Thursday. The Senate will likely take it up the following day and try to pass it before the previous CR expires at the end of the day. Passing a short-term CR will allow lawmakers to delay funding decisions until President-elect Trump is sworn into office on January 20th. Doing so provides Congress with the opportunity to enact even deeper cuts to HUD and USDA rental housing programs. Since 2010, HUD's overall budget authority for programs has decreased slightly by $54 million. Mr. Trump's transition team has indicated to congressional leaders that he would prefer them to pass a short-term CR rather than a full-year spending package so that he and his administration could have input on spending priorities, which includes cutting federal spending for everything but defense. For fiscal year 17, HUD needs $1.5 billion in additional funding over the amount provided the previous fiscal year, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Housing Service needs an additional $18 million, just in order to maintain existing rental assistance contracts and funding levels. We're still waiting to hear whether the CR is being written with the fiscal year 16 numbers or with the higher funding allocation that Congress agreed to provide for fiscal year 17. A CR at fiscal year 16 levels would result in deep cuts to critical housing programs that could cause thousands of families and children to lose access to stable, affordable housing, putting them at increased risk of homelessness, as well as losing accessible housing for millions with disabilities. A CR that freezes voucher funding for the entire year at the 2016 level would cause more than 100,000 housing choice vouchers to be lost. So we are urging you to contact your member of Congress and urge them to enact their final fiscal year 2017 spending bills as soon as possible and ensure no further cuts to housing programs, and also to tell them what these further budget cuts will mean for your communities. So moving on from fiscal year 2017 into the next fiscal year, 2018, the Budget Control Act of 2011 set into motion very low spending caps on federal spending for defense and non-defense programs. Since then, Congress has reached short-term agreements to increase spending over these limits. However, tight spending caps returned for fiscal year 2008 for the 2018 budget and pose a significant risk to housing programs. And we know this from experience. The last time sequestration went into full effect, 100,000 families lost access to HUD's Housing Choice Voucher programs, and 60,000 fewer individuals were served through HUD's homeless assistance grants. The Government Accountability Office found that due to a $400 million cut to the Project-Based Rental Assistance Program, PBRA, brought about by sequestration, HUD short-funded contracts with 800 private owners, representing almost half of the project-based rental assistance portfolio. In HUD's other programs, block grants to every community were cut, capital improvements to public housing were significantly reduced, putting viable housing and family at risk, and jobs were lost as a result. The Government Accountability Office also found that funding cuts made to public housing could lead to harmful long-term effects, including deteriorating living conditions and increased utility costs for the 1.1 million low-income households living in public housing. Under President Obama, Democrats have fought hard to ensure parity so that the impact of these spending caps have fallen equally on defense and non-defense programs. However, President-elect Trump wants to lift the caps on defense spending only, putting the full weight of these budget limitations on non-defense programs, including affordable housing. He has also proposed cutting non-defense spending by an additional 1% each year for the next 10 years, a proposal that could devastate HUD and USDA programs and likely increase housing poverty and homelessness. So we are urging, we ask that you urge your member of Congress to protect affordable housing resources from strict spending caps. And you should also ask them to lift the harmful spending caps, reach a deal as they have in the past, and when doing so that they ensure parity between defense and non-defense programs, meaning for every dollar spent on defense, another dollar is spent on non-defense programs. And then, of course, we ask that you urge your member of Congress to provide the highest funding level possible for housing programs, especially given the current housing crisis we're in today.
Before we move on, I just want to emphasize what Elayne has said about parity. We see that as being a really important issue going into next year. That is really what helped protect affordable housing programs from even deeper cuts. And so I just want to reiterate that when you're talking to your members of Congress, that should be at the top of your list of things that you mentioned. And as a side note, all of these slides and other resources will be provided to everybody after the webinar.
Great. Next slide. So given everything that I've said, we clearly have our work cut out for us in the coming years, and we know that the threats to critical affordable housing programs that serve the poorest households are real and significant. You know, we've talked about President-elect Donald Trump proposing to cut federal spending for everything but defense over the next 10 years. So we know that we really need to advocate and continue to fight for the housing needs of families with the lowest incomes that live in our community and ensure that their voices are heard. So to do that, we and other housing advocates are preparing a national report on the broad positive impacts of HUD and USDA affordable housing programs that we plan on sharing with members of Congress. Our hope is to feature a wide range of success stories to demonstrate how these programs have helped low-income people living in rural, suburban, and urban communities nationwide. We're hoping we plan to publish the report in early 2017. We've already received some great stories. We've heard stories about, home funds helping build, being the gap filler for housing developments. We've also heard about people being able to find and keep housing thanks to a voucher they received. So we really want to hear from you, and like I said, we want a diverse range of voices and stories to share with members of Congress. It's also important that we collect success stories from across the country, especially in those districts on our target list, which there is a link there for you to check out who is on our target list. But the deadline to submit a story is December 15th, so please feel free to share any great stories you have.
And just to jump in here, this is really one of the best ways to advocate for housing programs. If members of Congress can see the tangible benefits of these programs, especially if it's in their district, it's a really great way of turning somebody who might be unfamiliar with the program into a champion. So I really want to encourage you guys to follow up here. We're going to pause here for right now to see if there are any questions about appropriations issues.
Well, we have questions that are a bit more broad. We want to ask how likely it is that any legislation will be passed to protect housing programs. Is the next fiscal year budget negotiation a better window to protect housing?
So that's a good question. We'll get into it a little bit later about efforts from authorizers and things that they might be looking at. But in terms of appropriations, I think given what Elayne had spoken about the downward pressure on non-defense programs, which includes affordable housing, I think we're looking at a really, tight budget caps, and I think it'd be really difficult to see a major expansion of housing programs through appropriations.
Great, thank you. And just as a reminder for everyone, if you have questions as we go, feel free to type them into the question box, and we'll answer them at breaks like this. So moving on to the National Housing Trust Fund, a lot of the organizations that are on this call and advocates on this call played a really important role in championing the creation of the Housing Trust Fund and are working to help ensure its implementation on the state level. But this year we do see that the Housing Trust Fund could be under significant threats from lots of different angles. The first threat that we see is through the budget reconciliation process that conservative members may be pushing for in terms of tax reform. So tax reform is likely to be at the top of the agenda. President-elect Trump has made that one of his priorities. I think it easily say that it's a priority for many members of Congress as well. But as part of that effort, they may decide to use a budget procedure that's called a budget reconciliation, and that would allow them to make changes to both the revenue side and mandatory spending, but only need 51 votes in the Senate to do so. And I'm sure all of you are aware that in the last few years, we really haven't seen legislation move unless there were 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. So this is one way of being able to avoid any filibuster from preventing them from going forward. So if they do approach tax reform this way, they've made it clear that their goal really is to lower the corporate tax rate, and so they'll be looking for possible cost savings on the mandatory side to help them do that. So that is why the Housing Trust Fund might be at risk if this was a way that they decide to go. But the decision hinges on whether or not members of the Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee identify the Housing Trust Fund as a possible offset. So we are reaching out to members of these committees
to encourage them to remain and keep the Housing Trust Fund intact. So if you have members of Congress, whether senators or representatives who are on these committees, it's especially important if you start reaching out to them right now to talk to them about why the trust fund is important and why it should not be included in a reconciliation offset. But even if your members aren't on these committees, it's still important to educate them about why the Housing Trust Fund is so important. As many of your states have had their allocation processes approved, that would be a good opportunity for you to share with your members of Congress what your state plans to do with the Housing Trust Fund dollars. And as projects are selected earlier next year, it'd be a good opportunity for you to reach back out to them to talk about real projects that are going to be built and who those projects would be serving. The second threat that we see possibly to the Housing Trust Fund is through the appropriations process. So as Elayne pointed out, we're likely to see deeper budget cuts when it comes to non-defense programs, and that includes affordable housing. And in the past, we've seen Congress, in 2015, Congress kind of sweep up the funds from the Housing Trust Fund to plug holes in the HUD budget. And I expect that with the low spending caps and for next year, that there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to do the same thing this year. And that means that we really need to be talking to all members of Congress about why the Housing Trust Fund isn't just a theoretical program. These are dollars that are going to the states, making a real impact and serving a very unique role that isn't met by other housing programs. One of the things I think is would be good for especially more conservative members of Congress to know is that this program really fits snugly with what they look for in programs. It operates as a block grant. It allows a lot of local control in terms of deciding which projects to fund. And it's highly targeted to serve people who have the greatest and most acute housing needs that the private sector just can't reach. So our job is really to get that message out there, and we'll be following up with materials to help you do that. There are other threats that we see, and that includes possible efforts to repeal the Housing Trust Fund's authority, or we also might see differences if a new FHFA director comes in terms of deciding whether or not to put the resources towards the Housing Trust Fund. Those are threats that we see on the horizon that we will bring to you when and if they come up. But for right now, I think the best ways for us to focus is on the appropriations threat and the budget reconciliation threat. Are there any questions on the Housing Trust Fund?
Well, I think it might be going back a bit, if that's all right, Sarah. Someone asked you to clarify the filibuster procedure.
Sure. So in the Senate, typically, in order to avoid a filibuster, senators would file a motion called a cloture motion. But as long as senators have 60 votes, they're able to prevent debate on a bill. And we saw this a lot when it came to last year's budget conversations. Democrats were able to hold the line and prevent some movement in the Senate on their appropriations bills. Republicans have also used it in the past. But that's really the selling point of the reconciliation, is because they don't need because the budget reconciliation isn't subject to a filibuster, they only need 51 votes to get something through. So that takes that off the table as in terms of a tactic that maybe Democrats or moderate Republicans might want to use. Okay. Moving on, we're going to talk about efforts to reprioritize federal spending on housing. Diane's going to take that part.
Great, thanks, Sarah. This is Diane again. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition has led for several years now the United for Homes campaign to rebalance housing policy and direct scarce federal resources towards those with the greatest and clearest needs, low-income renters. So every year we spend $200 billion to help Americans buy and rent their homes, and the bulk of those resources, a full 3/4 of it, goes to subsidize higher income homeowners almost all of whom would be stably housed without the government's help. So there's just a quarter of those resources left to assist low-income renters, those with the greatest and the clearest needs. So the United for Homes campaign, which is a campaign of over 2,300 endorsers, organizations, and elected officials who have endorsed the campaign, proposes smart, modest reforms to the mortgage interest deduction that both increases the benefit of home ownership to low-income homeowners who currently have no tax benefit from having a mortgage, and it achieves significant savings to expand affordable housing programs that assist the poorest people, programs like the National Housing Trust Fund or Section 8 vouchers or a renter's tax credit. So there's two changes proposed. One is to lower the size of a mortgage on which you can get a credit for your deduct your interest. So to lower it from $1 million down to $500,000. So you can still have that $1 million home, but you could just deduct your interest up to $500,000. That change would impact fewer than 5% of mortgage holders nationwide, and it would save $95 billion over 10 years. The other change is to adjust from a deduction to a credit, a non-refundable capped credit worth a percentage of annual interest. That change would make the tax benefit of homeownership available to 15 million more lower-income homeowners who currently don't get any tax benefit, and it would realize additional savings. The two changes together save $241 billion over 10 years. So tax reform is coming. That's actually one of the clearest outcomes from the election, that with President-elect Trump and the Republican-led Congress have made clear that's a top priority. And reforms to the mortgage interest deduction are on the table. It's pretty remarkable, actually, how much the conversation around reforming the mortgage interest deduction has changed from it at one point being kind of a third-rail, untouchable program to it very solidly being part of the negotiations to reform in comprehensive tax reform. So the work that we have ahead of us now is to make sure that we retain those housing dollars for housing and redirect it and invest it in housing programs for the lowest income people, and not use the savings to pay for lowered tax rates, corporate or individual tax rates. So the United for Homes campaign, we're getting back to work in 2017, and we really hope all of you will join us. As I said, we have 2,300 endorsers. We'll be doing a call for all of our endorsers in January. We'll be revealing new tools and materials to help us in our advocacy. We'll restart our regular endorser calls and potentially have some legislative committee calls that meet more often because there will be a lot happening and a lot of action needed from us to ensure that we retain those savings for affordable housing programs. So if you haven't endorsed the campaign yet, please make sure that you do so that you get our invitation and can participate in our call in January. We'll be sending out more information on that soon. Okay.
And the last major action that you can take to help impact affordable housing in the next few months is to help try to include housing spending in any infrastructure package. So right now it's really unclear whether or not Congress and the incoming administration will be able to pass an infrastructure bill. It was definitely at the top of President-elect Trump's campaign messaging, but there might be some in Congress, particularly more conservative members of Congress, who would oppose an outright spending bill on this. So more recently, we've heard about ideas about an infrastructure tax credit, so not direct spending, but the question really comes down to whether or not Congress and the administration decide to move forward on this, and whether or not they'll also need Democratic votes in order to get a bill through. We feel very strongly that any infrastructure package should also include funding to increase resources for affordable housing infrastructure, like roads and bridges, Affordable housing is a long-term investment that really helps communities, the economy, and families thrive. Specifically, we think that among other spending, any infrastructure bill should include an expansion of the Housing Trust Fund. It should include additional vouchers, money to repair public housing, and as well as access to any infrastructure bank if one is created. Typically, folks on the Hill think of infrastructure as just being about roads and transportation. That's really our job, to educate them about why building and preserving affordable housing is so necessary and why it creates jobs and helps boost economies. They've said that their main goal with an infrastructure deal would be to provide a long-term economic path for the United States to help boost our economy, create jobs. Housing obviously does that through construction and preservation efforts. So that's another thing that where you can have an impact in terms of letting your members of Congress know that housing really should be at the top of the list. Are there any questions about these last two topics?
Yes, one question about the United for Homes campaign is whether we have been working with the real estate industry on those questions.
Yeah, certainly we've had a number of conversations with the real estate industry, and I think the real estate industry isn't kind of monolithic, and the home builders and the National Association of Realtors remain strongly opposed to any kind of changes to the mortgage interest deduction. And in fact, the home builders this year, for the first time I think in their history, began endorsing candidates before the elections and had as kind of their top three priorities that they sought from candidates who would receive their endorsement, a commitment to retaining the mortgage interest deduction as it is. So that opposition is real and it's strong. What I find interesting is that, like any industry group, I think the national industry message can sometimes differ from its individual members. And so I've had conversations with a number of realtors who support changes to the mortgage interest deduction and see its necessity and actually see it as a benefit to their business, because when you think about having so many millions more homeowners, the potential for low-income homeowners to get a tax benefit when they don't get any now, and reforms to the mortgage interest deduction could allow them to, they see that as new business. So there are a number of individual realtors and members who do support some change, but certainly that opposition is out there and it's strong.
Great, thank you. We've also had some more general questions about different aspects of the American Housing Program. One question asked whether Fannie and what changes we expected for Fannie and Freddie under the new administration.
Yeah, and just before I do that, just one more thing that I would say on the previous question around the real estate industry is that I would hope that now that we're at a place where reforming the mortgage interest deduction is on the table, and because we saw, in a number of bipartisan proposals, we've seen reforms to the mortgage interest deduction suggested. We've seen Speaker Paul Ryan really open the door to the possibility of reforming the mortgage interest deduction in his A Better Way plan. And the previous chairman, David Camp, when he put out his comprehensive tax reform package, it included changes to the mortgage interest deduction. And my understanding is that the House Ways and Means Committee are using a combination of those two as a starting point for the legislation that they'll use to move comprehensive tax reform. So I think now, I would hope that now that we're at a place where I think some change to the mortgage interest deduction is likely, that we can really unite behind the idea that we ensure that housing dollars stay within housing programs. So we'll see. I think there's been some indications by certainly some conservative groups who have agreed that, sure, if we're at a place now where the conversation has shifted so much that we're talking about what do we do with the savings from mortgage interest deduction, then absolutely we need to unite behind making sure that we're keeping it within affordable housing programs. So Fannie and Freddie is the other question. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there now. You know, folks will remember that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac both remain in conservatorship under FHFA. They've been there since 2008. There have been attempts over the years to comprehensively reform the GSEs. There have been some attempts to just recapitalize them and release them back the way that they were. None have been successful. So 8 years after receivership, they remain in the same state. And I think it's really unclear at this point what happens next for them. We saw the proposed incoming Treasury Secretary say that at the top of his agenda, and President Trump elects, or I think he said in the top 10, not quite in the very top, but in the top 10, would be some changes. And he proposed something that sounds like recapitalize and release Fannie and Freddie back without comprehensive reform. But we know that there are members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, who have very strong ideas about changes that should happen before we recapitalize and release them. So we may see more attempts to comprehensively reform them in the Senate or the House, really differing proposals like the one that Chairman Jeb Hensarling, House Financial Services, put out to essentially dismantle and eliminate them, to proposals in Corker-Warner that would change the way that they're structured, and in doing so, significantly increase contributions to the National Housing Trust Fund. So it's really unclear what would happen next. The one pressure that remains is the fact that they are in conservatorship, and all of their profits are swept back to the Treasury under a deal that was implemented just a few years ago. And so their capital buffers are declining, increasing the necessity, the eventual necessity of a draw from the Treasury. And if we get to that place, I think that kind of, depending on the size of the draw, could be the kind of thing that moves Congress to make a change of some sort. So we might see negotiations around that come up again.
Great. And then just moving on, we wanted to bring a couple of other issues to your attention, things that we see that you should put on your radar that might be coming up or that will be coming up over the course of the next year. The first one is a move to push legislation that would implement Paul Ryan's A Better Way anti-poverty plan. He released this earlier this year over the summer, and it really includes a lot of ideas about how to reform housing programs and improve economic mobility. And there are certainly some areas of opportunity for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition to work with Speaker Ryan and House Republicans on this, primarily around increasing mobility, helping families move to areas of opportunity where they have better access to schools and jobs and transit. But there are other elements of the Paul Ryan anti-poverty plan that we see as very troubling, and that includes a move to impose work requirements and time limits on people who are receiving housing assistance. We've seen similar efforts when welfare reform was done in the 90s, and the results were pretty clear that this had a very negative effect on many low-income households. So I included some links to reports that have been done here about how we saw an increase in people living in deep poverty as a result of welfare reform efforts in the 90s. So we remain very concerned about that, and we'll be in touch with you as we see legislation around that moving. The second item that we see on our radar is a tax on fair housing. We expect, or I expect at least, language in appropriations bills that would roll back HUD's efforts to implement its affirmatively furthering fair housing rules. We've seen attempts in the past to add language onto the Senate bills. Last year there was an amendment and it was ultimately neutralized, but the pressure seems to be mounting, and a lot of conservative members see this as social engineering
and government overreach, and that's really driving their push to roll that back. That means it's really important for us to start educating members of Congress about why they should see these fair housing rules as furthering their goals. Many Republicans are including Speaker Ryan, are interested in promoting economic mobility, and the affirmatively fair housing rule and the tools that they put out are really going to help communities think more about how they can increase that economic opportunity locally. So I think that's part of the message that we should be sharing with them. And finally, I wanted to bring up on the radar both threats and opportunities to the low-income housing tax credit. We mentioned earlier that many Republicans will be seeking to do tax reform in order to lower the corporate tax rate. And in order to do that, they're talking now at least about reducing the rate from 35% to maybe 15%. To really have a drop that much in the corporate rate, they need to eliminate nearly all of the tax expenditures, which puts the low-income housing tax credit at risk. So this is really the time for us to be reaching out and continuing to build support for S3237, which is a bill that was introduced by Senator Cantwell and Senator Hatch earlier this year. This is the bill that would both expand the low-income housing tax credit, and it includes a number of reforms that make it help developers better serve people who have the greatest needs. So we really see this as a really great opportunity to continue to push that bill, and it maybe even gives us a little bit more opportunity because to enact those reforms, because Republicans are always looking for ways to make the programs more effective and efficient, and those certainly would help do that. On the other hand, there might be an opportunity to preserve and expand the low-income housing tax credit, possibly in an infrastructure spending bill. So it's kind of unclear which way this will go, but we see both opportunities and threats there. So if you're concerned about the low-income housing tax credit, you should also reach out to your members of Congress on that too. And now we'll open it up to questions. I'm sure you guys have a lot. Feel free.
Great. So I will just start with some questions that actually began at the beginning of the webinar. I apologize that we haven't gotten to you yet. First, a question about whether NLIHC would support transit spending as part of an infrastructure package.
Well, I think there's a lot of possibilities for what could be in an infrastructure package. You know, of course, our focus is on housing for the lowest income people. Transit-oriented development, I think, is another possibility and opportunity through an infrastructure package. We would want to look to see any kind of housing dollars that are proposed in that way, that are targeted for the lowest income people. But I think, you know, a lot of what Sarah said is very right on about really being unclear about what an infrastructure package might look like. And whether the entire package, even if there may be some opportunities for moving some priorities, whether the entire package would be something that could be supported. There's just a lot unknown there about, and some you know, kind of rumors that are troubling about what might be in an infrastructure package. So we'd have to consider those types of things as well. And I think also, you know, while we've seen certainly President-elect Trump very enthusiastic about creating a new trillion-dollar spending package, we've seen a cooler reception, I think, from some Republicans on the Hill who are less interested in a major new spending package.
Great, thank you. We also had a question about whether there's evidence of an issue with homelessness or affordable housing in counties that strongly supported President-elect Trump.
Well, that's really, did you want to say something, Sarah?
Yeah, that's a great idea. From my experience working in rural housing issues, I just saw a great piece of information from Lance George at the Housing Assistance Council about the real explosion of housing inaffordability in rural counties. And so, you know, I think that is a real opportunity for Republicans to focus on some of their constituents who voted for them. Rural housing tends to be overlooked in lots of ways at the federal level, and so there's definitely a need to address both homelessness and housing affordability in those communities.
Yeah, and I would just add on to this, Diane, that the affordable housing crisis for the lowest income people is pervasive. It exists in all communities. Our research shows that clearly. So whether it's rural or urban areas, there is a need for housing solutions for the lowest income people. So I can say with certainty, without having looked at, sort of overlaying the results of the election with the map, that there is an affordable housing crisis in the communities that voted for Trump. But to actually do that overlay could be interesting, something that we'll pursue.
Yeah, and another issue that President-elect Trump ran on was revitalizing inner cities too. Seems like a very holistic approach, and so we hope that we'll be able to work with the administration there to focus on affordable housing programs that serve the widest population.
Great, thank you. One other question, how can we work across states to strengthen our message? And how can we better hit themes in addition to housing's infrastructure? How should we be best advocating and coordinating across states as advocates?
Well, that's some of the work that we do here at the coalition and certainly hope to achieve. So we are we're a membership organization, and we work closely with state partners. We have 64 state partners in 44 states. In most states, they are the statewide housing organization that advocates for affordable housing solutions at federal, state, and local levels. And you can see who the partners are that we work closest with on our website. Under About Us, we list out our state partners. So we really rely heavily on them to help mobilize when there's action needed at the federal level. And some of the work that we do with them is to bring them together to work together on achieving these solutions. So we're actually just headed into next week. We have our state partner coalition meeting here in DC. We meet together twice a year and talk about exactly that, how to, considering these number of groups and all of the people that they represent and they mobilize, how do we best use that power to both protect and expand these affordable housing programs. So you should, if you ask that question, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards. We have terrific housing organizers at the coalition, each of which is sort of oversees a part of the country and would be really glad to talk with you. Did you want to add on, Joey?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd like to add, sorry, this is Joey Lindstrom with the field team. I'm one of the organizers. I cover the western part of the United States. And sometimes when I hear about coordinating across states to do effective advocacy, I'm hearing from people who live in states or districts where their elected officials are already supportive of housing programs and the things that are highest on our agenda. And advocates in those cases oftentimes don't feel like their advocacy is as useful. I do a lot to try to sort of dispel that notion, because while it might be true that the senators or representative where you live are generally supportive of housing programs, it's also true that that senator or representative has a list of priorities on which housing may be number 1 or number 10, right? So if you find that your representatives are already supportive of affordable housing programs, please ensure that they're co-sponsoring housing legislation in the Senate and the House, that they're considering initiating their own legislation, and that they're not simply just a good vote. So I feel like sometimes we think it's people who are represented by our opponents who need to do all the advocacy work, when in fact there's a lot to do for everyone, no matter who your representatives are.
And just to add on to that, I think it gives groups a really good opportunity to reach out to new partners that maybe they hadn't reached out to before. So this is an opportunity for you to work with other housing groups that might be located in a rural area or serve rural areas. You can expand your footprint that way by building relationships at the local level with groups that are serving other districts other than your own.
Do you have any other questions?
We do have a few more questions.
Okay.
see. So how do we see the NLIHC and other housing advocates fitting into broader coalitions? Broader coalitions to further progressive causes and social justice issues in the current political environment?
Sure. This is Elayne. I could talk to that or speak to that. So we've been doing a really great job of reaching out to other organizations that don't necessarily work on housing issues, but because of intersectionality, they should be caring more about housing issues and speaking out about the importance of housing, and that includes healthcare groups, child welfare groups, education groups, and for me, criminal justice groups. We've co-lead a coalition working on housing and reentry issues, and we've really reached out to all sorts of groups, including civil rights groups, groups really focusing on drug policy issues, disability rights groups. So we've really have made a great effort recently in trying to get other folks to the table to talk about why housing is important.
And we've also added to our policy priorities for the coming year, kind of expecting that we'll need to work across broader coalitions. We've added a focus on broader anti-poverty solutions. So we hope to be playing a bigger role when it comes to talking about other safety net programs, wage issues, other things like that aren't directly into housing but have an impact on whether or not housing is affordable to people.
Yeah, this is Diane, and it's a great question and so important, and it's another one, frankly, of the challenges I think that we have ahead of us, because although we've all been making some real inroads into expanded coalitions, multi-sector coalitions, as Elayne said, and we've had some real exciting progress there where more and more issue area focused people see housing as central to those other issues. So I think, Matt Desmond's work, writing the book Evicted, really helps shift the conversation where more and more people see housing as central to anti-poverty efforts. We've seen in the healthcare sector, certainly leaders like Dr. Megan Sandell from Children's Health Watch, who talks about housing as a vaccine, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, who before the election put out a transition memo talking about how affordable housing is healthcare and making the case for an expanded Section 8 voucher program. Similarly, in the education sector, we've seen some of the education lobby industry groups who bring thousands of teachers to DC every year to talk about their priorities, and those teachers have been seeing more and more kids just churning in and out of their classrooms and see the impact of it on those kids, on their families, and the entire classroom, that they've raised affordable housing as a priority of theirs. And that's also promising for the strength that we can have and the success that we can have in pushing these solutions forward. The challenge is that we talked about a number of the threats ahead to affordable housing and community development, but the healthcare sector faces their own challenges, and the education sector faces their own challenges. And I think one of our biggest one of the most important things that we have to keep in mind and figure out how to do moving forward is how to remain interconnected, to be allies to each other in these different threats that impact low-income people, and still find a way to work together on advancing affordable housing solutions. Okay, so looks like we're coming close on time, and I think we may be out of questions. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. We had a terrific turnout for this. I hope it was helpful to you. We certainly will be staying in touch and reaching out and working together over the next few years to be successful in our efforts. I just want to, again, remind you that we are a membership organization, and really to encourage you, if you're not already a member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, to become one. You can be a member as an individual or as an organization. We welcome and appreciate everyone. We appreciate the financial support. You should know that the membership fees are on a sliding scale basis, so any amount is helpful to us. And beyond the financial support, it's helpful to us to have strength in numbers. So please, if you haven't joined already, consider joining the coalition. You can find out how to do so on our website, and we will send you information on that. When we also send you the PowerPoint slides from this presentation, and we'll send you some follow-up information about becoming an endorser of the United for Homes campaign, our fact sheet on housing as infrastructure, and another reminder to contribute to the report that we're putting together on housing success stories. So much more to come. Thank you all for your work and for your dedication, and we look forward to being in touch again soon. Thank you.